Okay. On to my next guest, who is also very familiar with the military and its customs and standards. I've got with me Colonel Roman Golash. He is Ukrainian by descent, and you've heard him on this program before. And I've not talked about this topic in a long time, but it's definitely time to talk about what's going on in Ukraine. And, Roman typically checks back with his family members over there frequently, if not daily, to find out how they're doing. So we're going to get an update on that, about how the war's going. And we've got much, much more to discuss with him as it pertains to Ukraine. But I think it's important to note, Newsmax reported, as did other outlets, that the Russian Defense Ministry said 4 of the U.S. delivered Army Tactical Mission System missiles equipped with cluster warheads were shot down by air defense systems, and the ammunition of a 5th had detonated in midair. The ministry said U.S. specialists had set the missiles' flight coordinates on the basis of information from U.S. spy satellites, meaning Washington was directly responsible. Responsibility for the deliberate missile attack on civilians of Sevastopol is borne above all by Washington, which supplied these weapons to Ukraine, and by the Kyiv regime from whose territory this strike was carried out, the ministry said. So you've got the Russians blaming the Americans now for this attack, this most recent attack. Yeah, you're right. We're supplying them. We absolutely are supplying them. We're giving them technology as well. There is so much more to discuss about that. And right now, though, it's not really looking tactically that great for Ukraine. They're doing what they can. They're pushing back. But Russia has really solidified itself into the southeast section of Ukraine and firmly is established in Crimea. And the way I look at it on the map by the Institute for the Study of War, it appears to me that they're getting awfully close to that port in Odessa. So, Roman, Colonel Golash, tell me, how do you see it?
Well, thank you very much, Jeanne. Good to be on your show again. The situation in Ukraine goes in different kind of categories. One, I talked to my family in western Ukraine, and they now have several hours a day of no electricity because of the unbelievable bombardment by the Russians into all sectors of Ukraine, trying to destroy the energy grid. They're also targeting hospitals, schools, and civilians as well. On the plus side, the Ukrainians are targeting refineries in Russia and are diminishing the ability of the Russian forces to have the fuel they need. Then on the other plus side, they've pretty much cleared up the Black Sea with their own Neptune rockets, and most of the ships from Sevastopol have left and gone further east. On the ground war, you're correct. Ground war is still grinding on. Mm-hmm. The good news is that the offensive that Putin started in Kharkiv on the northeastern front has been stopped. The towns have been taken over. There were numerous Russian soldiers that gave up, so that's going well. And then the West deciding to give Ukraine the right to use Western weapons on Russian soil has been tremendously helpful.
Well, I mean, so, all right, you've kind of laid out the battle lines, but what's going on in the interior? What's happening in the hearts and minds of the Ukrainians? How are they feeling? How is this? How are they supplied? How are they getting the manpower? Tell us more about that.
Well, the food is still there. They're getting food.
Were they able to get their crop in?
What's that?
Were they able to get their crop in for the spring, for the planting?
I think where they could, they did. Mm-hmm. If it's further east, then of course the probability of getting a crop in is less and less. So electricity is the big thing. The morale is still strong like it was in the beginning. People are, though, some are getting worn out, but they collectively feel they have no choice. Because if they give up to Putin, that's the end of them. So there's no future in that forum. So they have no choice but to continue to fight on.
Well, NATO's meeting for a Washington summit coming up, and it's apparently the 75th anniversary of the NATO treaty organization. And
Right.
I imagine Ukraine's going to be one of those things that is on their mind. And there's talk, apparently, of extending a hand to Ukraine and saying, why don't you join us, but not making that a formal not taking any formal action on them joining NATO until after the war has been settled out. That could be years.
Well, that's correct. And that recent article by the Hudson Institute, written by Luke Coffey, mentions this. And they said that the meeting in D.C. should include invitation of Ukraine to join NATO. Most people don't realize that Ukraine has been part of the Partnership for Peace program since the 1990s when I was in Ukraine. All of our emblems had Partnership for Peace. But the other elements is that inviting Ukraine, but also to realize the Russian threat, which is going to be continuing no matter if they win in Ukraine. Then the cascading event continues into other countries, as well as predictions of China attacking Taiwan, believing there's poor leadership on our side. And
they just attacked that. They just attacked those two little small boats in the Philippines, like literally attacked them. So China's on the move.
And then you have the recent alliance or super alliance between Russia and North Korea. Mm-hmm. So North Korea might be emboldened.
Putin's just he's got the motliest friends around. I mean, you've got the Ayatollah, you've got the North Korean dictator, and you've got the Chinese. I mean,
he does,
these guys are all just a bunch of misfits. But
they are a bunch of misfits, so it's still pretty interesting why some in our government are still supporting or do not realize the threat from Russia in Ukraine, and they don't realize the size of the battlefield there, which extends almost 1,300 miles. Okay,
well, we're going to get right back to that after this break because Trump said Zelensky is one hell of a salesman. You know, he shows up in D.C., we give him $60 billion, he comes back and he gets another $60 billion. So we're going to talk about that, and we're going to talk about essentially fighting this war with one arm tied behind our back, if not two. We'll be right back after this break. Welcome back. It is The Real Story, and still with me is Colonel Roman Golash. And Roman, listen, this is an incredible, this is a very informative article. Because, when we go to war, we expect to go to war full force. No half measures. People are going to get killed when you do half measures. You need the full force, kind of like the bombing we did in Germany. Bomb them to smithereens. That's what we did before. That tends to work. And you get less people killed over time. That's what happens. But that is not happening here. Not at all. And Owen Matthews, writing in the Spectre UK, wrote Zelensky's peace summit flop. And he talks about his global peace summit in Switzerland was meant to demonstrate the world's support for Kyiv and underscore Russia's isolation. It did the opposite. Russia wasn't invited. China didn't send a delegation. Other major countries that might influence the Kremlin, including Brazil, India, and Saudi Arabia, South Africa, and the UAE, refused to sign the watered-down agreement. That's what he goes on to say. He says, though, in the end, 78 countries signed the final 4-point communique, which called for Ukraine's territorial integrity to be the basis of a future peace, down from Zelensky's original 10 points, which were supported only by the U.S. and the EU. Okay, though the Kremlin likes to claim otherwise, Ukraine's declined support has little to do with Putin's charm offensive. All of Russia's closest neighbors, except Belarus, have distanced themselves from Moscow. Russia's deepened its ties, like we talked about before, with Iran, North Korea, and China. But rather, this is the problem here. This right here is the problem. For practically every country and global bloc, economic and strategic self-interest has trumped principles. The EU has taken the lead on sanctions, but hasn't banned Russian oil, merely capping the price at $60 a barrel, rather than the $73 for Urals crude. Europe never sanctioned Russian gas. It continues to import 15% of its liquefied and natural gas from Russia and 8% of its pipe gas supplied via Ukraine and Slovakia. Gazprom paid transit fees of $850 million to Ukraine Last year, which is about 46% of Kyiv's GDP, making Kremlin one of the largest taxpayers in Ukraine. And it goes on and on and on. It talks about the global south wants to continue importing Ukrainian grain and cheap Russian oil. India's economy has been boosted by a large increase in imports of Russian crude. Much of it is re-exported back to Europe as refined petro. Turkey imports Russian gas and re-exports it to southern Europe. Okay, so the point is like they're feeding the beast and making this not come to a conclusion as quickly as it could. It's not total war. Plus, the U.S. has said, look, by the way, Ukraine, we're giving you these weapons to use, these missiles, but you cannot use them against a Russian military target that is not actively engaged in the Ukrainian war or potentially looks like it's going to be engaged in the war soon or immediately, or it's basically a preemptive strike that's going to happen, within the next, hour. I mean, these are ridiculous rules of war. Who trades with their enemy when they're at war?
Well, the initial problem that Ukraine had was with President Biden, where he slow-walked aid from the beginning and continued to slow-walk aid, almost tiptoeing towards giving more and more weapons. So you give them a couple of M777s, you give them some HIMARS, but you don't, like you said, you don't commit fully. So if Ukraine would have gotten a lot more early on, the war would have more possibly been over. It didn't give Russia a chance to build the miles and miles of trenches, putting in a million mines. Mm-hmm. And with that additional aid, the Ukrainians had the momentum. Ukraine, on the other hand, does not want to offend the United States and the European alliance. So they were trying to also kind of keep the Russians at bay, but they didn't want to tick off our allies, and so they wouldn't use weapons. And if they did, they were their homemade weapons, like the Neptune rocket that they used on Russian ships in the Black Sea. So I think that if things were done a little bit differently, and if we would have learned from past experiences like Korea and Vietnam, mm-hmm. Where our Air Force was flying against Russian pilots. And no one said much, well, we're flying against Russian pilots. Well, how about turning the tables and bringing in volunteers from the United States Air Force to plow the field, clear the landmines, and get a direction going for the Ukrainian ground forces? That hasn't been done. Also, the weapon systems, they talk about $60 billion. Most of the equipment Ukrainian gets is old equipment mm-hmm. that we are ready to dismantle, and it would have cost us even more money. And the money appropriated goes for our replacement, which a lot of these rockets have an expiration date. And so Ukraine has already experienced some of the ATACMS being duds because they're just too old.
Right.
But still, they're using them to the full effectiveness, and they're very accurate.
Yeah, no, I mean, you get my point, though, right? We're fighting half a war here. Apparently, now I will say this. It does say that the war is consuming 40% of the Kremlin's budget. So that's good. But Russia has 4 times Ukraine's population, a wartime economy that's 20 times larger. And Russia's GDP is set to grow more than any G7 nation this year. So life in Moscow is pretty normal. They're not feeling the heat.
Well, not exactly.
Okay, good.
Russia's GDP is a lot based that they've gone into a wartime economy. So a lot of the money they're just funneling back into building war items. But if you look at some of the numbers and you talk to people, there's less and less goods in the stores. This past winter, many of the Russians had lack of water. The pipes were bursting, no heat, and that's because people were conscripted to go in and fight in Ukraine. The other element that the Russians have not yet realized is many of the casualties, over 500,000 now, came from the prisons. So Russia closed their prisons down because the Ukrainians took care of them for them. And then they were using a lot of soldiers from Siberia, from small towns, and then mobilizing them, sending them to the front to be killed. It's very unfortunate. And so far, there hasn't been a great kind of yell to stop this.
Well, I mean, you know, I think that everybody is really rooting for Ukraine at the end of the day. I think that they really are. We need to be. If we're not, we have to be. Nobody should be rooting for Russia here. I just feel like our leaders have handcuffed this war to some degree. Hey, Roman, I'm out of time. I got to go to a hard break here. So I will have you on again, and we'll talk more about this. But I want to thank you for lending your expertise to this conversation.
Thank you so much, Jeannie.
You bet.